Welcome, everyone. Hi, my name is Kathy Granillo, and I'm hosting this webinar along with my co-host, Carrie Nicholson, today, and also Carol Chambers, who couldn't join us, but she's helped us put this all together. Welcome, and thanks for joining this webinar today. This webinar is brought to you by the Women of Wildlife Community Team, part of the IDEA working group, and we are dedicated to helping women succeed in the wildlife profession. Many thanks to those of you who filled out the pre-webinar survey. We are going to use the results of that survey to learn more about what the Wildlife Society can do to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in the wildlife profession, and to help us develop our action plan for implementing the DEI vision that we just recently put out last year. I want to give a shout out to our two TWS interns who developed the survey and assisted with development of this webinar itself. Valerie Ramirez and Cassie Ferry, I believe they are both on the webinar today. They will be summarizing the results and providing them to council and staff, and ultimately we'll get them back out to membership. And please, you will all get a follow-up email with another little brief survey after the webinar, and we hope that you will participate in that. Of course, it's optional, but please, it'll help us out quite a bit, and we thank you ahead of time for doing that. So let's get on to our webinar. We are highlighting a brand new book that's due out this fall. It is titled Women of Wildlife Science, Building Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It's edited by Carol Chambers and Carrie Nicholson, and there are 42 authors of the various chapters in this book. We are going to be hearing, we thought we were going to be hearing from 3 of them today. One of our authors had to drop out at the last minute this morning. She is ill. That's Dr. Mamie Parker, and we're wishing her all good thoughts and sending hugs and stuff, but we will be hearing from 2 of our other stellar authors from the book. We are going to have their presentations. Since this is a webinar format, we have, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you have a little Q&A bubble thing there. That's about, on my screen, it's the third over from the right. That is where you can put in any questions or comments that you might have for our speakers or in general. And we are going to try and address all of those at the end of the presentation. So please feel free, as you think of things or have questions, pop them in there, and we will try and address those along as we go through and as we finish. So first, and please don't use the chat because it won't work for you guys, okay? All right, Q&A. Our first speaker is Dr. Deanna Doan Kreider, and she is the director of the Animo Partnership in Natural Resources, coordinator for the Native American Rangeland Partnership, and research personnel at Salish Kootenai College. She holds dual citizenship in the United States and Mexico. And I'm going to turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Man, I'm really happy to see so many people participating on this. This book has been, oh my gosh, quite a hair puller. Carrie will testify to that, so will Jamila. But I'm really pleased with how it's turned out, and I think it's going to have a huge impact, and I'm very honored to be a part of that. As Kathy said, my name is Deanna Doan Kreider. I am an Indigenous woman, but also of Irish descent, and am a rather free thinker when it comes to things like westernized science and so forth. And so I was partnered with some wonderful women to co-write chapter 5 of the book. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And I'm glad that Jamila's on the call too, because Jamila, I may call on you to, make a few statements or whatever. But I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Is that set up for me? Kathy, think so?
Should be.
Okay.
That little green button at the bottom hopefully works for you.
It says allow Zoom to share my screen. I am sorry that I did not pre-plan for this. Hold on just a second. Let me get this done. And I don't know why it's not letting me do this. So what I may do is just go ahead, and I think it's got a privacy issue on it. Oh, I see. I have to unlock it. Sorry about that. All right, here we go. contents of my screen until it is quit. Ugh, I don't know that I want to do that, right? Because if I do that, it might. You know what? I'm just going to talk about this. So one of the things that we wanted to do with this chapter, and let me go ahead and acknowledge my co-authors, and that is Jamila Blake and also Ruth Plenty Sweetgrass She Kills. She is at Noida Hidatsa College and is a member of the Mandan Hidatsa Arikara Nation. And many of you know Jamila as well. So being several women of color, we were asked to discuss what creates an equitable environment. And I know that a lot of you work in terms of, trying to increase diversity for your organizations or for academia in general. But I think it goes much deeper than that. And so one of the things that we did with our chapter, and I hope that you get to read it, is that we use the analogy of the Columbia River to describe how we felt about, creating an equitable environment. And the Columbia River, as you know, has a lot of tributaries to it, and it was an incredibly diverse river before colonization. And now I think there are over 60 dams on the Columbia, and it's quite altered. So the reason we picked the Columbia River as an analogy to this, and the way that we would tell our story, was because to restore the Columbia River would be a very complex task. And it's not just a matter of like throwing some fish in the river and hoping that they float. And I feel like, or we feel like, with the diversity initiatives, that's kind of what it's been like, is tossing some fish back into the river and hoping that things float, mainly because you're dealing with entrenched dams made out of cement that are very difficult to break. When I say entrenched dams, I'm talking about things like just institutional boundaries and things like westernized science, which we'll talk about in just a minute, because that is actually one of our largest barriers, is how we view science and how we kind of paint ourselves into a corner and create these dams that make it really difficult for these fish to get over. And we're kind of stuck with that. So one of the things that we talked about in the book chapter had to do with a term called hysteresis. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of that, but hysteresis is a term used in physics, and it describes an unstable state. And I will again use an analogy of a river or a lake to talk about that let's say you have a lake that's been contaminated and has all kinds of problems, with triggers all kinds of other problems. So let's say that there's phosphates or something like that being poured into this lake or this river. Just going back and repairing the source of the phosphates is not going to restore the river. You have to now go back and clean up all of these secondary factors that have impacted the river or the lake, and figure out how you're going to backtrack out of that. And that's going to be really difficult to do. So that's kind of where we are with diversity today. We have a very profound and injurious history in this country with the treatment of marginalized groups. And so to, take down some of those dams and try to restore the system is very complex. And it's going to take some, number one, very deep thought. But the other thing that's going to take is some very serious commitment. Scholarships are great, putting people of color in your marketing, campaigns and that sort of thing are really great, but that's not going to fix it. That's opening your doors and saying, okay, you guys can come back in now. It's not going to fix the problem. So we're going to talk about some of those very deep-seated issues, some of those log jams that are, creating barriers in the river. And what we're going to do is we're going to coin this whole picture in the terms of habitat restoration. So what we want to do for diversity is we want to make it good habitat, not just habitat, good or excellent habitat for everybody. How do you do that when the majority of people who are marginalized represent such a small portion of your population here? So that's really important. I think we all know as ecologists how beautiful a river can be when it's been untouched. And we also understand the concept of diversity and, just how all of those things interact to support one another. before colonization on the Columbia, you had the salmon people, many people who were living along that river, who were very intimate with that river and who had very spiritual and traditional connections with that river. All of that knowledge was taken away, was basically erased, and a society came in thinking that they knew better, took over. And if you look around your landscape today, you'll see that there's been a lot of damage done. I just drove up through the Central Plains. I am living in my travel trailer right now in a horse pasture in Lolo, Montana. So if you hear some funny noises in the background, that's what it is. But on this trip, I got to see a lot of different habitats and so forth. And I came up through the Central Plains, and I was actually quite disheartened to see how much of those plains had been plowed up. And we're even going to see more of that now that wheat is becoming such a commodity. We're quickly going to see the disappearance of our grasslands. But when we look at these landscapes, they're highly injured and very, very difficult to restore. A lot of you may be restoration ecologists. You know how difficult it is to get rid of invasive species and then to give, those native plants what they need in order to be restored. That goes as deep as soil and their microbes and those things that may not be there anymore. So again, I want you to keep that in mind as we talk about diversity and whatnot. So let's talk a little bit about the history. So with hysteresis, when we want an understanding of how to get ourselves out of this stable state, it's really important that we understand the history of how we got there. Hysteresis basically requires a certain threshold to get us over the top of that and be able to get into a state of stability. So again, we wanted to talk about that, and hysteresis is often used in river ecology. A lot of the publications that are out there about hysteresis are in Australia and so forth. So if you want to read more about that, we have those publications listed in our chapter. But again, a really important component about hysteresis is understanding the history of what it took to get us here. When we talk about that history, of course, it's important to know that our science today, what we view as westernized science, came from the Royal Society of England back in the 1600s. And unfortunately, the people who made those decisions for the Royal Society of England were pretty much 100% white males, European males, who had no understanding of, the ecosystems in the North American continent, had no understanding of the people that lived there, the relationships that they had. And they also made decisions for mainstream society. So very little input was received then in terms of how they viewed science and how they viewed the decisions that they made with that science. So that carried over, of course, when, universities were built here in the United States with that very highly influential, bias towards white males. And so then you throw in people who were here and who were then removed off of those landscapes and put off on reservations, or you had people who were forcefully brought here who also knew their own landscapes and their own continents. And, you're starting to build up a little bit of resentment here. And I'm just going to just put it out there that, we've been learning a lot in history about what's happened with the Indian schools, Indian children that were forced into white schools. I just want to ask you the question, when you think about increasing diversity in your own agencies and organizations, ask yourself if marginalized groups should trust non-marginalized groups to teach their children or to accommodate them in their own missions that were designed for mainstream society. It's important that you know that, because that distrust is still there and we have to repair that. And I know there are a lot of people that would like to just move on and get over it and that sort of thing. But when you distrust somebody, it's really hard to move forward. So we have to address those issues. We have things happening like, for example, and Jamila wrote a really nice segment in our chapter about a young man named Otabanga. Otabanga was captured. He was a Mbuti man who was from the Congo, and he was captured to be brought over for the World Fair in Chicago, in St. Louis, I believe, in as late as 1910. He was kept in an exhibit next to the gorillas, and he eventually committed suicide. And those types of stories are very extreme, but they also kind of give a picture of how westernized science tries to objectify things. And this is really important for people to understand, especially when it comes from marginalized groups that have emotion, that we have feelings, that we have, many of us have very strong connections to the land. And when we are taught to separate ourselves from our subjects or separate ourselves from the land, that really is a really poor fit for people who have very distinct worldviews that are different from those of Westernized science. Our entire academic system, our entire government system is built on the principles of that Westernized science, to remove ourselves, to look at it objectively. And so as a person of color, I know I'm camouflaged by my white skin, but I was raised in the Mexican culture. My grandfather was an indigenous man. My mother was indigenous. And I was raised to be very passionate and to be very connected to the topics that I was interested in. I was raised to be very concerned about the communities where I worked. And so if you are a young student like I was, and I had no choice but to come to the United States and go have an education in our universities, because I wanted to be a wildlife biologist. I wanted to be in natural resources. In Mexico, we didn't have wildlife biology at that time. So I came here and I was taught a very Westernized approach that would suit me just perfectly if I wanted to go work for the US Forest Service, if I wanted to go study elk on the Lewis and Clark Forest or something like that. But if I was a young Native student and learning all of this material and trying to go back home, where my culture is very different, my traditions are very different, even my land policy is very different, those are very poor fits. And that's what we expect of our students, is when they come to our schools, we train them with Westernized science, but it's a very poor fit. Native Americans don't necessarily follow the principles of Westernized science. You know, they have a very holistic and a very circular vision of things, but none of our schools are really willing to change their curricula to make room for them. And that's very difficult because often you don't have many Native students and you have to incorporate that. We know our professors are busy, they're, you know, overloaded, they don't have time to do this, but we ask ourselves, why don't we have more Native American students? Why don't we have more students of color? Why don't we have more marginalized groups in our profession? It's a catch-22, and we have to fix that before we can move forward. So again, it's an issue of trust. It's an issue of how these systems were built and do not fit what many people believe, yet they are asked to you know, accommodate those ideas versus people accommodating their views. And so as you read the chapter, you'll learn about all of these different factors that contribute to very poor habitat for people, for marginalized people. So how do we restore habitat for everybody? You know, those of us who have not had to deal with, you know, things like racism or things like exclusion. And I will admit to you, because of my white skin, I'm a bit camouflaged and I have not experienced the things that my grandfather or my mother experienced, both of whom had very dark skin and lived in cultures where they were highly discriminated against. But I have been around my colleagues enough. I have, you know, known what my family has gone through enough, and, you know, to know that there are a series of factors that contribute to very poor habitat for people who are marginalized. We talked a little bit about trust. One of the things that got you into this profession, if you're not a person of color or a marginalized person, was your passion. You know, most of us love this profession. I love what I do. But often, you know, that passion is combined with things like being able to do things that, you know, build health for our communities, or that fit with our worldviews, fit with my own spirituality about how I view the land and landscapes and my own people and that sort of thing. If you don't have those things, it's going to be very difficult for you to stay in that habitat. And if you can sometimes get a foothold in that, let's say you're surrounded by mentors, you're surrounded by people who do care about your passion and do care about your own community concerns, maybe you can get a little bit of a foothold there. But is it enough to push us over the threshold to get us into a stable state? That's going to be tricky because our numbers are so few. Trying to get all of that rolling at the same time is challenging. Right now, there are a lot of efforts to do what we call cluster hiring in academia and so forth, where, you know, we can hire several Native American faculty members or whatever to bring them into our system so that they can mentor our students. However, I will note that in some of the projects that I'm working on, one of which is called the Willow Project. It's a National Science Foundation project between University of Montana and Salish Kootenai College to identify barriers for Native American recruitment for faculty and students. One of our biggest barriers is that faculty are not willing to adapt their curricula to include other worldviews or to take the time to mentor Native American students that have different needs and so forth, different religious needs. They need time off. They take time off for family. Family's a priority. That to me is one of our biggest barriers. So when we want to do cluster hire for Native American faculty, they don't want to go work at these places where they're asked to become white. So that's challenging in itself. How do we get those mentors in there? We have got to fix the habitat first, then attract the faculty, then attract the students. And that's a lot of work. That's a lot of dams we have to blow up. The other thing is respect for culture. And I'm going to just quickly talk about this for a minute, because there is a big difference between one, respecting culture, and two, appropriating culture. We're not asking everybody to become like we are as marginalized people. We're just asking you to respect our differences. It's very offensive when people try to appropriate religious beliefs or even spiritual, or even cultural beliefs that Native Americans have. Same thing for even other countries, Mexico. Everybody wants our food. Everybody wants all the good stuff, but nobody's really willing to get up there and fight the fight for the things that we have to do to make a place acceptable for us. So just be wary of that. And also be wary of the fact that we have what we call the white savior complex, where people, or trope, where people get in there and try to rescue us. We don't need rescuing. We just need respect, and we need empowerment. We need to have a place at the table where we have as much say as anybody else at that table, and not being asked from the back of the room. The other thing that is important that people understand is that different cultures, different marginalized groups have different traditions. They have different needs. Even when you're talking about people who are physically challenged, we address that in our chapter. What needs to happen there? It's not just a matter of building some ramps. It's not just a matter of wearing a rainbow t-shirt. It's a matter of truly having empathy for people and understanding and asking what their needs are, and then supporting them in that. So support is a big thing, is to be able to know that you have colleagues that are kind of right there with you, helping you to create a better habitat for everything. There are a lot of mechanical issues that are keeping our diversity, minimizing our diversity, keeping our system fairly homogeneous. Things like mobility. A lot of our people of color have families. They're not able to move. We're caregivers. We don't want to leave our communities. We want to work there. But oftentimes we're asked by agencies and academic positions to go ahead and, move according to what those needs are, and not necessarily what the community needs are. But another big one that everybody might want to start paying attention to is the fact that most of our minority serving institutions, whether it's tribal colleges, whether it's Hispanic serving institutions, or historically Black colleges and universities, do not necessarily have the curricula needed to qualify them for, some of these specialized disciplines, wildlife range, forestry, and so forth. So generally agencies tend to recruit at the schools that do have the curricula for that. Many of you have pulled your hair out over applying for jobs through OPM, and you know that it's extremely specific in terms of what those classes are. So it's challenging for a student coming from a minority serving institution that's about 8 classes short, who wants to go into forestry. How do they do that? They'll never get in unless they get into the biotechnician position, and then they stay there. We never see our people of color getting up into leadership positions, because often they're limited by their curricula. So there are some things that need to happen, which I'm going to list in just a minute. But that is a very significant barrier, as most of our students of color anyway are not at the mainstream universities where we have these programs. So I don't want to go through all of the mechanical limitations, but they're listed in the chapter. So what I did want to do was I'm going to read you a segment out of the chapter that lists, what do we need to do in terms of, restoring habitat? Aside from, blowing up the dams of, some of our deep-rooted principles. For example, like even the mission statements of many of our, agencies and so forth are again directed toward mainstream society. It's very difficult to redirect an entire mission for an agency toward marginalized groups. But this is pretty important, because those marginalized groups think very differently than those mission statements. So those are dams that are going to have to go through a lot of review and discussion in terms of how can we change that to where our marginalized people even want to come through the doors. And I'll be honest with you, oftentimes we peek in the door and we see, yeah, this is great. There's a scholarship for me to come in there, but do I want to go in there? I don't think so. That furniture doesn't fit me. The walls don't fit me. I'm not even going in there. Dorcetta Taylor, who is a very well-known researcher who has done a lot of work in diversity, she has surveyed a lot of students of color, and we know that they're passionate about nature. We know that they want to know about nature, but we're just not seeing them. So there's a lot of fish out there. They're just not making it over these dams. And we don't even know who they are because they disappear before we even get to them. So there's a lot of research that needs to be done. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read you just a final piece in our chapter because it goes through everything very well. We put a lot of work into writing this, and so I didn't want to disregard that either. So the good news is that these barriers are surmountable. Professional organizations need to begin to reach out to a wider range of students. Career counselors and teachers should be provided with sufficient information to point their students in the right direction. Oftentimes we see career counselors telling them, oh, you want to study biology, go get a conservation degree, and they find out they don't qualify for any job. So we need to get them educated as well. Larger land grant universities have to build or strengthen bridge programs with smaller colleges. Oftentimes these universities do this because they get to be part of a funding grant and get overhead for this. This is a highly sensitive topic that smaller universities are very well aware of this. And so we need to have our larger land grants step up to the plate and start doing it just because it's the right thing, not because there's money involved, not because there's potential publications, but because it's the right thing to do. We caution that these efforts must be accompanied by a good dose of consideration and sincerity. That needs to be on the table. Targeted recruitment of students from underrepresented backgrounds raises skepticism of institutional motivations to increase their own diversity numbers or funding opportunities. Students are very aware. Faculty members are very aware that you want us to represent diversity on some committee or whatnot, but are you listening to what we really want in terms of input to change the system? Oftentimes we feel like nobody's listening, that we're just there to look pretty and to make things look diverse. Keep that in mind. These are very real sensitivities. And you can talk to any person who's of color or marginalized and they will tell you they feel the same. To most underrepresented students, these are telltale signs of shortcomings in the type of organic support needed for those individuals to succeed and become passionate about their jobs. Basically, we've figured it out. We're not falling for it. Larger universities need to explore their roles in strengthening place and culture-based academic institutions to help empower communities. My rule is let the tribal colleges teach tribal students, but we need to empower them to do that. Native Americans are now asking that they want the flexibility to, quote, indigenize their own science. They want to do it their way, and that's what we call sovereignty for these nations, and I think that they deserve that after being shut up for so long. This can be done through community relevant research or collaborating to co-teach essential courses that are place and culture-based, but without the high tuition cost of large universities. That's also a barrier. Co-learning between institutions would also help less marginalized students learn about the societal challenges and cultural values of underrepresented communities, which will only make them better professionals and problem solvers at a more inclusive scale. These improved relationships will eventually cultivate more equitable and collaborative efforts down the road that will benefit everybody involved. So that's my presentation, and I'm going to open it up for questions. But what I really want to do is leave you with some very deep thoughts about what it truly takes to restore this environment so that it's equitable for all of us. And go ahead and use your ecological application to that. When you're sitting there looking at a river, think about how that applies to what we're trying to bring this profession, and really, walk the talk, not just say it. So that's it.
Great. Thank you, Deanna. That's a lot to chew over, a lot to think about. Great introduction to your chapter. We are going to take questions in the Q&A, as we said, and we'll get to those at the end after we hear our next presentation. Speaking of, our next presenter is Dr. Catherine O'Donnell. She's an ecologist and decision analyst with Compass Resource Management in Vancouver, BC, and a co-founder of the Wildlife Society Out in the Field initiative. Catherine previously worked as a wildlife biologist with the USGS in Florida, has a PhD studying forest management effects on salamanders from the University of Missouri. Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Kathy. And just give me a thumbs up that you're seeing my screen.
Seeing it.
All right, great. Well, thank you everybody for attending and tuning in. I'm really excited to be part of this webinar, and also you know, to see the end of this book project that we've been a part of for a few years now, and very excited for everybody to get a copy and get their hands on it when it comes out this fall. So I'm going to be talking about the title of my talk, and the title of our book chapter is called Breaking the Binary. It's about LGBTQ plus perspectives in wildlife or perspectives. Make sure this is advancing. There we go. Okay. Just going to start off by defining LGBTQ plus, which is the acronym that we tend to prefer in our chapter and out in the field, which I'll talk about in a minute. So this is an initialism for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and the plus stands for related identities. And you've probably seen other variants of this, like GLBT or LGBTQIA. There's sometimes, you know, other letters involved, or you might just hear it referred to as the queer community. And the reason for that is that these preferred terms can evolve over time, and they can also vary from person to person. So just keep that in mind. Want to define a few things really quickly. Gender identity, which is a person's self-identification as a man, a woman, a blend of both, or neither, which is agender. Sexual orientation, which refers to a emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction to other people. Gender expression, which is different than gender identity. This is how you actually present your gender. So this can be expressed through things like behavior and clothing, or the way you cut your hair, the way you speak. And then finally, assigned sex at birth, which is sometimes referred to as biological sex. And this involves things like hormones and chromosomes and anatomy. A few things, you'll see these things kind of pop up every once in a while, just, you know, food for thought, that every person has each of these four identities, or these four characteristics, whether they spend a lot of time thinking about them or not. And the reason that our chapter is called Breaking the Binary is because all four of these are spectrums, right? None of these are a binary. However, in society, traditionally, at least in Western society, these are frequently treated as binaries. Are you a man or a woman, right? Are you gay or are you straight? Are you female or male? But none of these are strictly binaries. There are lots of combinations, and where somebody falls on one of these spectrums doesn't automatically dictate where they fall on the others. So there's tons of different, infinite combinations of these different identities. We displayed just a couple of them here. But if you've never really spent a lot of time thinking about your own, you know, what your gender identity is or what your gender expression is, you know, perhaps take some time with a diagram like this and think about where you might fall on this diagram. Okay, so I wanted to define a few of those terms before diving into, you know, what Carol and Carrie and Kathy asked us to talk about today was kind of a success story. And so I wanted to talk about our work out in the field. And in my mind, this has kind of been linked with the book chapter that we've been working on. There's overlap between these groups, the group of co-authors and the group of organizers, and they kind of started about the same time. So anyway, I'm kind of jumping back and forth between the book chapter and out in the field. But so as you might be aware, Out in the Field is a group within the Wildlife Society. And we started back in 2019, and it was really triggered by this article that Travis Booms wrote in The Wildlife Professional. And it was titled, "I Am One of You," and a gay wildlife biologist perspective on our profession. And a number of us reached out to Travis and responded to this, because it was incredibly brave for him to write this article. And so this is a picture of the four of us back in Reno in 2019, which was the kickoff of this initiative, this Out in the Field initiative. So these are the four original co-organizers or co-founders: Travis Booms, Claire Crow, Colleen Olfenbottle, and myself. So like I said, we launched at 2019 with our big kickoff event was a luncheon. And it was open to everybody. We encouraged allies to come. And we were expecting, we budgeted for about 40 people to attend. We really didn't know what to expect. And we were getting pretty nervous the night before and right before the luncheon, not knowing how many people would show up. And as this picture shows, you can see how many people showed up. It was standing room only, overflowing out into the hallway. I think the total count was over 150 people that showed up. And so Ed Thompson, who was the CEO at the time, actually ordered more food on the spot, ordered more tables to be brought in, more chairs to be brought in order to accommodate the extra people. And this was just this overwhelming, show of support. And it was we couldn't have imagined a better launch or a better kickoff to this initiative. We did a lot of planning going into this, a lot of conversations, a lot of emails back and forth. And so there were a few other things that we launched at that conference in order to create a welcoming environment for LGBTQ+ wildlifers. Those of us that were comfortable wore these ribbons throughout the conference. And we found that, especially a lot of younger people and students, came up to us and were really happy to kind of see some visible role models out in the field, so to speak. We also distributed these rainbow pins and pledge cards. I'm wearing my rainbow pin today. So we designed these pins and we made sure that anybody it was only the four of us who were wearing these tags that were giving out these pins. And we wanted these pins to really mean something, right? I think sometimes ally can be, sort of performative. And so we wanted these pins to really have a meaning. And so we made these pledge cards and attached the pins to the pledge cards. And so you can see what it means to wear the pin. And we encourage people to keep the pledge in the back of their name tag so that they could flip it around and show people. If somebody asked, what does that pin mean? You could flip it around and say, well, it means I'm not going to use anti-LGBTQ language. I'm going to speak out, et cetera, et cetera. So we developed these 3 goals, which is in short order: to increase visibility, which the pins and the ribbons went a long way towards doing. Build a community of LGBTQ+ wildlifers, and create more support for LGBTQ+ wildlifers, especially students in this profession. So, we had this great kickoff. We were feeling pretty euphoric in 2019, and then we all know what happened in 2020 and 2021. And so we couldn't have, we were worried about kind of carrying this momentum forward without being able to have in-person conferences. So we started going online, as everybody did, and we had a bunch of Zoom socials. And we've started doing these roughly quarterly. And these are the highlights of my month whenever they happen. They're so much fun. And we keep these limited to people who identify as LGBTQ+. And these have really helped us grow our community and expand it to people who sometimes aren't able to come to the conference every year. Although I will say we're very much looking forward to being back in person in Spokane. We've done a lot of other work in the last few years. You can check us out on our website. We have a web page on the TWS website. So just wildlife.org/OITF. We have added additional organizers, and their names are listed at the end here, but Adam and Andy and Liz and Alan and Silas have all joined, and Carter has also joined, and I don't have his picture on here. We launched a Twitter account, so you can follow us on Twitter at TWS_OITF. We have over 600 followers now. We've designed some gear, so don't go to Target and buy Pride gear. You can support us instead. Get some TWS out in the field swag. There's a link on our through our, it's pinned here on the Twitter account. We also have created what we're called the packet, and you can again find this under the news subheading on our Out in the Field website. And we really designed this with TWS subunits in mind to help spread the initiative and help people implement out in the field activities and events at chapters and section events. There's also information in the packet about the pin and the pledge card and things like pronoun guidance. We've also collectively written now I think 3 wildlife professional articles. The most recent one you can see here. And so those are also included in this packet. So briefly, why, some people still question, why is there a need for out in field? Why is there a need, to have this support group? Because seemingly, and I have a graph in a minute, that support for LGBTQ+ people has gone up over time. Absolutely, and which is great. But the numbers of people who identify as LGBT keeps going up as well. So this is the most recent Gallup poll. So this is just Americans, but the most recent, so this just came out in February, the percent of adults in the US who now identify as LGBT is 7.1%, which is up from 5.6% from just the year before. And what I really want to emphasize is that this pace is growing, especially among the youngest members of society in our profession. So this is kind of what the trend looks like over time. Back in 2012 through 2016, it was climbing but pretty steady. And you can see this jump in the last few years. So this is a breakdown by generation, right? So, and it's self-sorted. This is Gen Z, which are those born between 97 and 2012. So in this poll right now, there's only 5 years worth of Gen Z adults, right? Because the poll is only 18 and older. So back in 2017, about 10% of that generation identified as LGBT. It's now 1 in 5, right? So let that sink in. 1 in 5 Gen Z adults identifies as LGBT. And the reason for that, again, the reason numbers are going up is because acceptance has gone up. And so people are more comfortable being their full selves. And it's becoming more acceptable to identify as something other than straight and other than cisgender. Come on. So on one hand, it's growing, and these, 18 to 23-year-olds are the ones entering our profession now, right? They're the newest members of TWS. They're our grad students right now. And so these numbers within TWS are only going to keep going up. We ran the numbers and we estimate now that there's probably between 700 and 800, based on these most recent numbers, between 700 and 800 members of TWS that probably identify as LGBT. However, there's still employment discrimination. There's still harassment and discrimination at work, especially among transgender individuals. And people still leave the profession and leave the workplace. And so it's not just about acceptance, it's also about safety. I was driving back from a camping trip this weekend and turned on the radio and heard this story, right? And it almost brought tears to my eyes because this is today, and this is in Idaho. This was just this past weekend. 31 people with ties to a white nationalist group were arrested for a conspiracy to riot right near a pride parade in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. So think about how many wildlife jobs are in Idaho. Think about whether an out wildlifer would feel comfortable going to a pride parade. And I also want to emphasize, this is one of the figures that we created for our book chapter, that there's a huge need to recognize intersectionality and to recognize privilege, and that so this diagram basically means that these identities above this horizontal line have more privilege than their counterparts below. So think about, what if you have multiple identities below the privilege line? And what if you have multiple identities above the privilege line? What's your responsibility to do what you can? How can you help those with multiple identities below the privilege line? And also think about what does the makeup of TWS currently look like? And what do we want it to look like in the future? And finally, I'll end with this, which is another graphic from our book chapter. And we can think about, sort of how out somebody is, so sort of the degrees of outness on a scale of concealment, so you're hiding things, to revealment. And we can think about this on two axes. So people might be out in their personal life, but not in their professional life. Or for some people, it might be the reverse. They might have a family that's not supportive, and friends who aren't supportive. And so, but maybe they're at college and now they're, which I would consider professional life. Maybe they're out at university and they now feel comfortably being able to express themselves, but then they go back home and they can't, right? So when you're not in alignment, we term this sort of this stressful limbo. When you're on this line, there's congruence between how out you are in your personal life and your professional life. And there's, the situation might change on a daily basis, depending on the situation. People might move around on this chart. But the point of this is that if we want to be a society and a profession where everybody is up here and feels proud, right, to bring their whole authentic self to the workplace and to feel comfortable being just as out in their professional life as they are in their personal life, then we still have some work to do. So here are some ways to help us get there, which I'll jump to the next slide. They're repeated down here. You can follow us on Twitter, check out that website that I mentioned. There's a bunch of links on there to join the mailing list. You can always reach out to any of the organizers for additional information. So with that, I want to wrap it up so we still have some time for questions, and thank the co-authors of the book chapter, Brenda, Travis, Claire, and Alex, and the other out in the field organizers, as I mentioned before. So with that, I will be happy to turn it back over to Kathy for the Q&A.
Great job. Thank you so much, Katie. Perhaps if you quit sharing screen, we have all our speakers pop up. If you're a presenter, please reveal yourself. so we can at least have faces to look at. Excellent job, everybody. I think we had a few questions in the Q&A. Carrie and I have been trying to answer some of these as we go along. Let's see, someone asked about of any events apart from the annual conference for Women of Wildlife. And I do keep an email list. If you're interested in hearing more, just send me your email. I put my email there in the Q&A. I'll put it in again if you got on later. Academic Crusader, thank you so much for bringing up disabled biologists. We totally acknowledge there's not a whole lot of written material out there that to draw on for the book. I know that it's definitely something that we need to keep in mind, and I believe Deanna brought that up too in her presentation. I don't know, Deanna, if you wanted to add anything more to that.
I would, and we discussed this. I appreciate the question. There is much more that's needed to be done. And I think one of the things that was really interesting to me as we were researching the background is that came up about a physically challenged person, or, you know, challenged in other ways. My husband is that, so we would live with that every day. That how they interact with their environment contributes so much to a quality of life. And we talked about that a lot in the chapter, that passion should be the #1 goal for all of us, you know, despite what, you know, marginalized group you're from or whatever. How you know, it's challenging already. Life's a bitch already, sorry, but it is, you know, how do we make life better for people, especially in their workplace? I know of an instance, for example, for the Forest Service, and I'll use this to talk about something else briefly that's important. And this person is wheelchair bound and is doing a lot of films and things like that for the Forest Service in terms of promoting, you know, outdoors for people who are challenged in that way or whatever. But it also highlights the fact that individuals that are from these groups are burdened with being the spokesperson for everybody, and that can be exhausting. I just recently returned from some really great conferences for Indigenous people in natural resources, and that actually came up, that they are often asked to explain to everybody what the challenges are, how they feel, how it's affected them, et cetera, and it's emotionally draining. We now know that there is enough information out there, enough literature, enough resources to point them in the right direction and say, you know what, go do your homework, read about it, and then we'll talk about it. But don't ask me to explain this 500 times. And I think that that's also the same with people who have different challenges. You know, it's exhausting to have to explain to people, yeah, you know, we can do this and we can do that, while at the same time, they are being asked to be spokespersons for their groups. That's important. But how can we help them not be the targets of all of this stress, you know, and all of this burden to do that? So I would like to see more work done in that area. Let's interview people. Let's get that information written so that people have those tools and don't have to, you know, put them up front and ask them for their, you know, opinion all the time, and let them be the only one at the table having to explain to a group of 30 people of, you know, blah, blah, blah. We don't want pity, but at the same time, those are very uncomfortable spaces. So I think we need to do some more homework there and help support them in different ways.
Unmute. The usual Zoom thing. Thank you so much. Katie, I don't know if you wanted to add something to that.
I think that was a great answer. Yeah.
We have a lot of very complimentary comments in the Q&A, thanking you guys for your wonderful presentations, and people are excited to get the book. I believe there's a question in there about when it's going to be out, and we're hoping, I see Carol joined us too. Carrie, I believe October sometime, and then we'll have copies at the conference if you happen to make it to the conference. Carol says October 18th is the publication date. And it's available through, who's our publisher? I'm so bad.
Johns Hopkins.
Johns Hopkins, thank you.
Yeah, actually the pre-link is already, the pre-order link I think is already available. Oh,
that's right. We could probably share that. We had some questions about early career professionals. Sarah Gaza raised some good comments there. You know, how to support younger professionals as they're trying to get established, and especially if you're a person of a minority, or a person, or a woman, or a person, however you want to classify yourself, something other than the norm. We do have a working group, early career professional working group in the Wildlife Society. Let's see, I see a hand raised. Oh, go ahead, Deanna.
Yeah, I want to encourage, you know, everybody in these different groups. You know, I think what happens in our profession is that, and I know we mean well, we try to create these templates and these professional pathways for people to get into and say, okay, follow this way. This is how you do it. You get certified, you do all this stuff. For somebody like me who studied in Mexico, a lot of the tools that I was given didn't work there. It's kind of like metric versus standard, you know, and it's like, oh man, this does not work. I was taught, you know, how to do wildlife research and, you know, how to do a density estimates and how to do radio telemetry and all that stuff. When I got down to Mexico, man, that was a big flop. How do you spend $1 million on a research project when one of your radio callers would pay the salary of a person for a year? So what I want to do is I want to encourage all of our students to really think how they want to build their education to create a profession for them that works for what their passions and what their desires are. This means that TWS is going to have to, we're going to be flexible. We're going to have to give them the metric and give them the standard and give them, invent new tools that will work for their communities. Because for me, I had to kind of piecemeal my education together, and I even had to go to different organizations. I'm not just a wildlifer. I do range, I do fire, I do all kinds of stuff, because we look at landscapes as this whole big picture and we don't separate it out. I want to encourage those students to, you know, you decide what your pathway is and you create your professional pathway yourself. You can do that. You know, I know that, you know, federal jobs and state jobs don't always allow for a lot of that, but, you know, I'm a person who quit all of that and I started my own organization, and I've never been happier in my life by doing that, because now I solve the problems that I want to solve. But I just want to encourage you that if you have dreams and passions that nobody seems to be addressing right now, you do it. You get out there and you forge your way for that. And that means, you know, forums like this, where you are a voice at the table and you are saying, you know what, I want to be able to go home to my Native American community, teach me about Bureau of Indian Affairs policy, teach me about land tenure issues, you know, let me bring in my elders onto my committees so that they can be part of my educational process, those kinds of things. So again, just, you know, you blaze your own trail.
All righty, I believe we are down to possibly the last minute of our presentation time here, and as I recall, these webinars just sort of end. So thanks everyone for attending. Really appreciate it. Have lots of great comments, appreciative comments in the Q&A. Oh yeah, Valerie, what are you reminding me about, Valerie?
Oh, taking the survey.
Take the survey. Please take the survey when you get it. Optional, but please do it. It's very helpful to us. And again, thank you so much, Deanna and Katie. Wonderful presentations. Great book. You guys will all have to get it when it comes out. Grab a copy, everybody. It's a lot of fun. I think the links in the Q&A to about the book. Oh, and I see Valerie put the link into the post webinar survey already but that's in the chat, Valerie. Let's see, can we put it in Q&A? All right. I think that's it, everyone. Thank you so much for attending.